Welcome to the DNA Talks podcast, where we take on the mission of unlocking the code of your genetics. This season is all about you, upgrading your health, not just on the surface, but down to the root cause. Join us as your clinicians at the DNA company investigate your DNA and beyond. The intention of this podcast is to enhance your lifestyle by changing what is in your control. This does not substitute the medical advice given by your personal doctor, therapist, and other healthcare professionals.
All right, and welcome to another episode of the DNA Podcast. We're calling this one Dream Big, Unlocking the Secrets to Better Sleep. And today we're diving into a topic that affects millions of people daily, or perhaps I should say nightly: sleep. Turns out that roughly 70 million adults in North America suffer from sleep disorders, with insomnia being the most common. 1 in 4 adults report having trouble falling or staying asleep most nights, and the impact of sleep deprivation is staggering. Chronic lack of sleep can more than double the risk of mortality from all causes. And to put that into perspective, being awake for 18 hours straight impairs you as much as having a blood alcohol concentration of 0.05%. And after 25 hours, you may as well be drunk. To help us understand the importance of sleep and how to optimize it, we have a very special guest, Mollie Eastman. Mollie is the creator of Sleep is a Skill and host of The Sleep is a Skill podcast. And after struggling with insomnia, she'll tell us all about it. While traveling internationally, she created Sleep is a Skill to help others learn the often forgotten skill set of sleep. And with a background in behavioral change and a deep fascination with chronobiology, and there's one for your lexicon, folks, Mollie has decided and dedicated her life to helping people transform their sleep through a unique blend of technology, accountability, and behavioral change. Mollie's expertise has led her to create one of the most listened to sleep podcasts on the planet, while popular weekly sleep newsletter as well for nearly 6 years now, and develop the signature Optimize Your Sleep course. And she's appeared in over a staggering 150 podcasts across the globe, sharing her insights and helping people achieve better sleep, consequently better lives. Mollie, welcome to the DNA Podcast.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me. This is going to be a very fun conversation and
It is.
hopefully help support people in wherever they might be at on their journey with their sleep, whether they're listening and thinking, oh, my sleep's okay, or really struggling, or anywhere in between. I'm confident that there's things that we can introduce that can take things to the next level.
Absolutely. And as a clinician of over 25 years now in practice, I used to say, and I say used to, this is really operative, that if you could encapsulate exercise into a pill and swallow
Mm.
that pill, you'd probably cure 50 to 60% of what ails us. I have now changed my tune. And I am now saying, add sleep to that, and you'll probably
Yes.
cure 90% of what ails us. I mean, do you agree? That sounded like an emphatic
Oh,
yes.
it was an emphatic yes, 100%.
Okay.
Now, I have a lot of biases that are very pro sleep, so I certainly call that out. But given what I see day in, day out, and the research that I'm in the thick of, what is really, really clear to me is that sleep is this opportunity for us to almost on the pyramid of wellness, where to begin of the many things that we can bring in for our health and well-being. And to your point, exercise and movement being a crucial component of that. But one of the things we see is that by putting sleep on the foundation, it helps fuel and support our goals with all of those other important and crucial interventions. So our movement, our nutrition, our mindset, all of these other components that are so important, they are aided and abetted by supporting sleep.
It's foundational. It's almost non-negotiable. And we're getting into the deep weeds as to what about sleep is non-negotiable. But the very fact
Yes.
that the amount of hours, I suppose, that we clock on the pillow is not the end story. It is the quality, the depth, and everything that goes on between those hours that is really important. That's what you're studying. And by the way, before we get into it, just as a reminder to our listeners that the intention of this podcast is really to enhance your lifestyle by helping you take charge of what is within your control, sleep being one of them. But this does not substitute the medical advice given by your doctor, therapist, or any other healthcare provider. So before starting any regimen, starting or stopping drugs, pills, anything you're doing or taking, always consult your primary healthcare physician.
Mm.
You're marrying the latest in chronobiology. We want some sort of clarity around what that term means,
Yes.
circadian biology and quantum biology. So, tell us about your story. Set the stage here. What was the impetus behind this for you?
Absolutely. Okay, first off, for me, my entire life now is about sleep all day, day in, day out. I'm talking about sleep. And yet it wasn't always that way for me. And how this really began was I went through this acute bout of insomnia and it completely shifted the course of my life. And I now think of my life in really a three-part series. I think of before I went through this period of insomnia, during and after. And so the before was really just a lot of fixed labels and narratives with my sleep. People might relate to some of these. So I would say things like, I'm a short sleeper, I'm a night owl, it's in my genes, maybe I'll sleep when I'm dead. Some of these ways of relating to sleep as if it's a fixed state and just the cards that I was dealt. But ultimately, under this umbrella of kind of just not a great sleeper, a bad sleeper, these things that we say about
Right.
ourselves. And that's how it was for me. And then I went through my life in that manner and I got similar results to someone who thought of themselves like that. And I didn't notice or connect the dots with some of the deleterious effects that were occurring with my health. So, meaning I was experiencing things like mounting anxiety, shingles in my 20s, painful
Mm,
periods, routine headaches, brain fog, a number of signs and symptoms that something in my health and well being wasn't working. But for me, it wasn't something where it was a clear connection or correlate of how I was managing my sleep or circadian health. It just wasn't in my purview. And so my habits become more and more pronounced as the years go on. And then as a serial entrepreneur in Manhattan, burning the candle at both ends, eventually then went through this period of insomnia that completely just shook me to my core. And part of the reason this was so concerning for me, it was because I came from or come from a family that has a lot of mental health issues. And so for me, so much
mm,
of my life was, is this going to happen for me? Am I going to go through some of these things I saw with my family members of some really serious mental health problems, and a lot of them interconnected and related with sleep? And as we know, there doesn't appear to be a single diagnosis out of the DSM, the latest DSM, that doesn't relate to something with sleep, maladaptive
right.
behaviors with our sleep. So sleep and mental health are very much interconnected. So when this occurred for me, of then night after night after night of suddenly not being able to count on sleep, and I will add in, I was also traveling during this time, so jet lag was in the mix, and a lot of stressors as an entrepreneur. And so that experience of starting to now question, am I going to be able to sleep? Has what I hadn't experienced that before. And so what started becoming the present for me is this sleep anxiety. And we see this commonly for people that when they start having troubles or struggles with their sleep, they start fixating on their sleep. And that was what was happening for me. So
Sure.
I'd wake up in the morning and now just immediately starting to think about the night ahead. Am I going to sleep? What is this going to look like? I can't go through another night. The sun would start setting and my heart would start racing of, oh, I can't do another night. I feel like I'm losing my mind. And that's what
Mm,
we see commonly because we know that this can be so disruptive to our health and well-being when we go through long stretches like this. And so eventually I go to the doctors and I leave with sleeping pills. And now, just as a quick PSA, in the United States, if you are struggling with your sleep, the first line treatment is supposed to be CBTI, or cognitive behavioral therapy, for
mhm.
insomnia. Unfortunately, we still see very commonly, and I think not as from a malicious standpoint necessarily, but just from a lack of a systemic problem where the average doctor right now in America, even out of Harvard Med, has about 2 hours of training in sleep. The thing we do a third of our lives, the thing that on average we're doing 26 years are spent asleep, and yet 2 hours are spent even considering how to really support people when they're struggling with this.
Bro.
So for me, I was left with these sleeping pills. I'm taking Ambien, Xanax, and while I'm traveling, Valium, very old school recommendation or prescription. So a
Benzos.
whole mess of ways of these band-aids and actually create their own problems of certain types of medications. So now I'm getting very scared that, is this my new reality? Am I stuck like this? So now I'm trying every book, hack, trick, spending a lot of time, energy, effort, money money. And then eventually, though, what I started to learn completely transformed my not only experience of life, not only getting me back to sleeping, but then eventually getting me in this conversation of optimization, which, as I shared before, I didn't even think sleeping well was on the table for me, let alone truly optimizing sleep. Um, so this changed my whole life. And what was so amazing about this is one of the things I stumbled upon was this topic of chronobiology, the science of time and how time affects our biology so fundamentally. And so what was required was to really transform how I was managing my health and well-being. But today, now sleeping quantifiably great. I bring in a lot of tech into the work that we do at Sleep as a Skill. So I have tracked and tested and looked and analyzed at my sleep in many different ways. And so quantifiably sleeping great on the right side of the bell curve. Today, interacting with thousands of individuals routinely to help support their sleep and coaching them around how to optimize their sleep. As you mentioned, the host of the Number Two Sleep podcast, which is just mind bending in and of itself. The for the last 6 years, we've run a sleep obsessions newsletter. So that's created this whole community of people looking to optimize their sleep, online courses. I've created a really large database of Oura Ring users because every person that we work with is required to wear the Oura Ring to participate in
Right.
our programs. And the reason that that is really valuable is we get to see truly what is moving the needle on the ground for people with their sleep. And this is really, really valuable because we get to have a protocol that has come out of this, and we have a whole training module that we put people through. And lastly, I'll say that we have established a unique niche in high stakes poker. So I work with a lot of high stakes poker
Yeah, I
players in
understand that. You're
particular.
doing a lot of work with the UFC and poker players, folks that really have to maintain not just focus, attention, alertness, concentration, which requires a good sleep, requires an optimal sleep,
Right.
but also
Yes.
acuity, cognitive enhance. So this is really what the crux of sleep. And I want to dive into, and I want our listeners to hear all about the program. But as we build to that, I'd love for you. I'm always, conscious of the concept. Of sleep architecture being important for folks to understand. Certainly, I feel like it's important for my patients to understand it, to give them some point of reference. Like what we're
Sure.
talking about here, what your area of expertise and focus is optimizing quality. It's not just time spent in bed, clocking hours on the pillow. It is that depth of sleep, the quality of sleep, what happens to the brain waves during that sleep, and what's behind it. So the program you've enlisted, I think it's brilliant. Frankly, I'll just start by saying, and then throw it over to you. I think, in fact, I've got literature to support this, that sleep is or lack thereof, let's call it sleep deprivation, is North America's number one silent killer, contributing to
Ugh, yes.
diabetes, obesity, stress, probably even the big C, cancer, if you really kind of put it
Yes.
all together, right? So just give it to us, simple as you can, give it to us. What is sleep architecture? Where are people failing in that sleep architecture? And maybe even a couple of tips to improve upon it on toward, forget about optimal sleep, just getting some better sleep.
Yes. I completely underscore everything you just said there. And I do think that is this silent killer. And it's surprising for many people how much it spiders into many aspects of their health and well being,
Sure.
and even surprising aspects of our experience of life, our ability to read faces interpersonally, our ability to make sound kind of. Choices or awareness in how we're interacting with the people in the world around us. So it is so far reaching, even beyond some of the things that we might guesstimate could impact us with our sleep. So it is a big, big deal. But when we talk about the kind of nuts and the bolts of it, when we talk about sleep architecture, couple things to be aware of. One of the things that I see is that a lot of people, if they are tracking their sleep, they do have some semblance of awareness around things like their deep sleep, their REM, their light sleep, and might even be getting concerned about some of their numbers and wanting to influence those. So, what I would like to do is just kind of pan out for the individual so that we can kind of simplify this. And just at its most rudimentary way of looking at our architecture, we can think of it this way, where in the beginning half of the night, the first half of the night, we tend to have a higher ratio of deep sleep in the first half of the night. And that deep sleep has got a lot of press in recent years, since 2012 and the discovery of glymphatic drainage with a G versus lymphatic drainage with an L. Glymphatic drainage with a G is this ability for us to, what appears to mean this cleansing of the brain on the first half of the night during deep sleep, and could have these correlations between staving off, hopefully, neurodegenerative disorders, or playing a role in neurodegenerative disorders like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, dementia. And so this has meant that it's gotten into more of the mainstream conversation, because before we didn't think we had as much of agency to influence these, especially decades in advance of when they might kind of start showing up as far as symptoms. So that's a deep sleep on the first half of the night is one component, not to mention human growth hormone, repair mechanisms, many aspects of our health and well-being that we want to really cultivate. On the second half of the night, then our ratio starts moving over into more REM, rapid eye movement. And REM is crucial in many regards for our health and well-being, but certainly some ways that it's been summarized has been your inner therapist, has been one way it's been described. Overly reductive and simplistic, but I think that can be helpful for the average person to know just how important this is for our emotional bandwidth and well-being, and making sense of the world around us, and deciding what are some of the things that we need to kind of solidify as far as our memory stores, and moving into the subsequent day and kind of preparing us for the day ahead. And unfortunately, there are many things that many of us might be doing that could be impacting both of those aspects, the first half of the night and the deep sleep rich side versus the second half of the night, and even drugs that we might be taking, or
Alcohol,
casual alcohol, THC. Some of these are
caffeine.
known. Caffeine, right, could really be suppressing some of these sleep stages. Now, I will say, as far as the topic of sleep stages, because many people are getting into this gamification of wanting to augment some of these numbers often. And what I do want to call out is that on any hand and wrist based trackers, the least accurate information right now is the sleep stage classifications. And even on the trackers that are pretty well known for sleep, for instance, Aura has been a bit more the reigning champ right now for sleep. And yet they're at 79% accuracy for sleep stage classifications. But that does get more nuanced, because even if you are to go in lab, we know that when you go in lab with a PSG, which is the gold standard for testing your sleep right now, the agreement there is still only in the mid 80s percentile. So different technicians
Right.
might think and score you as being in deep sleep versus REM in different capacities. So we still have a lot of questions in that domain. So I would encourage people not to, get overly stressed out on a day-to-day basis based on what comes back on those wearables, but we can pan out and look at trends. Additionally, knowing that because of how we've run our days, there is actually a different need for different sleep stages depending on what's going on in your life and how you're managing yourself. So, meaning, if you will commonly see this, if we see a death in the family or a major life change, we might see an augmentation of REM to help process that component. And that makes sense that the body and mind would be prioritizing that versus some of our athletes and marathon runners and what have you, that then
Right.
they might be requiring more deep sleep during that period of their life. So it is meant to be dynamic and a bit of an accordion model.
Got it. And I love that you brought up, glymphatics, because, it was maybe 10 years ago. It's certainly been in the last, as you pointed out, since 2012 that we've even, or the scientific community has even come up with more than a few different reasons as to why we sleep in the first place. I mean, I know it's an
Yes.
age old sort of wives' tale that perhaps you die of lack of sleep before you die of starvation. And by the way, I'm going to put you through a little myth truth rapid
Oh,
fire
good.
in a couple of minutes, and we'll get a
Yes.
bunch of those, sort of put those, debunk the junk, some of those out to rest. But this whole idea, and thank you for explaining that architecture, certainly the first half of the night, allowing our brains to unwind, if you will, but also detoxify. Our brains don't have that lymphatic system the rest of the brain has. And actually, at the DNA company, we're testing folks for
Yeah.
this variability to detoxify at night, reliant on those systems. And some of us are just better at it than others. And frankly, some of us need, for that reason, deeper sleep, more quality sleep than others. And there are some things, lifestyle, biohacks, if you will, technologies that I know you're very familiar with, and in fact you implement in your program. And then, of course, the second half, you described it more of the, Freud, come talk to me, lie on the couch, and let's see where things are at. From the psychological perspective. So, going through these stages, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, deepest level, bounce up into this REM, where most people, by the way, I'm sure you'd agree, think this dream state, rapid eye movement, is the deepest phase. It's not, it's the lightest phase, right? And that's where we're dreaming. That's the second half you described. But if you will, and before we get into this rapid fire, where are we failing in North America as it pertains to what we've now sort of acutely called sleep hygiene? We know hygiene means wash our hands. We know it means sort of, defend ourselves versus, bugs and so forth. But what is sleep hygiene, and how can we implement that so as to translate it to better sleep architecture?
Ah, so good. So many people might have heard of sleep hygiene, and sometimes I feel like it could use a rebrand because it can almost
Hmm.
bring about a sense of like morality or something, as if they're bad and wrong if you've deviated. But it's really looking at some of these healthy habits, behaviors, environmental factors that can really help and aid in getting a great night of sleep. And yet, I think there's an opportunity for us to expand the aperture on what does it take or what is required to ensure that we are getting sufficient and quality sleep routinely. And some people might hear sleep hygiene and they're like, ah, I'm doing these things. I got a relatively dark bedroom, going to bed somewhat around the same times, and can just start to feel like they're doing everything and they're not getting the results. But what we see at Sleep as a Skill is that I think there's an opportunity to shift the narrative and really bring in both a level of simplification to how we're thinking about what does it take to get great sleep. And I would argue that at its core, one of the things that can make the difference and actually encapsulates many of these sleep hygiene components, but I hope gives a more empowering and different angle at it, is what we call the indoor issue. And
Mhm.
what we call the indoor issue is because even out of 2001, the EPA did a study and they found that the average person was spending about 93% of their time indoors in the United States. And that broke down to in buildings and automobiles. And in both situations, in a environment that's divorced from the rhythms of nature. And so me, not just like from a woo perspective, but from a biological hardwired perspective of the signaling mechanisms that tell our body what time it is and what to be doing when.
Right.
And so when we actually pan out and understand what's at its core, then what would be the disruptant of that would be to actually start behaving and shifting our how we're managing ourselves to get ourselves outside more routinely. And that can almost sound so simplistic that it can just be tossed out, but that is at its core with what you talked about before, chronobiology, circadian rhythm optimization, and quantum biology. So all three of those are about the far reaching effects that occur if we live in an environment that is set up to have brighter days and darker nights. So what I find is that when we have brighter days and darker nights, that works in this sleep hygiene piece, but more elegantly and effortlessly.
Sure.
So what we see there is, instead of an average indoor environment, that the average indoor environment has around 500 lux on average or less, in if you were to measure the lux output of the light that you're in indoors. You go outside behind, go past, like I'm in this windows behind me. If I go outside behind these windows, then we can measure the intensity of the lux in a normal environment. And on a summer's day, it could get to 100,000 lux. That is a massive difference from the signaling mechanisms that it tells the body what time it is and what to be doing when. These clocks in every cell and organ in our body are all communicating and trying to be kept on time with our suprachiasmatic nucleus, or SCN. And just even the proximity of the SCN, the placement is very close to the eyes. So it makes a lot of sense that light becomes our primary Zeitgeber or time giver And that's why this becomes more important, and actually a organizer of this, old, sleep hygiene way of thinking. Instead, if we modernize it and actually look to the past, ironically, of how we used to live, then that can help us, because if we are starting our day with bright light exposure from the moment we wake up, that sets apart a whole cascade of effects that will affect hormonal balance, your energy, even the two crucial hormones for sleep when we think of innately of being cortisol and melatonin. Those two kind of poles on either side of our days get so anchored in a powerful way. And the other piece is, if we are aligning with these rhythms of nature, they kind of take care of some of the sleep hygiene rules and recommendations, which are consistent wake up time, where we're waking up at around the same time 7 days a week, which I am not finding the average person doing, even though they might think they are. When we look at a lot of their readouts, commonly there is more variability than they might realize, especially on the weekends.
Right.
And so when we start living in alignment with this, a lot of this gets handled, not to mention that things like low vitamin D are just prevalent and epidemic in our society. And just simply the presence of being outside under that sun can affect our ability to create serotonin and then in turn melatonin for the evening. And it can sound so simple, but it is not. And also, it is challenging for the average person to create this in their environment. So it actually does take a lot of scheduling and planning of how to get yourself some of the recommended dosing of light, which out of Dr. Sachin Panda's research out of the Salk Institute, he's gotten a lot of press. He's on Andrew
Yep.
Huberman and what have you. He was our most listened to podcast of last year. And his research has found that bare minimum being outside 30 minutes to 60 minutes daily is what's required for making subcellular melatonin, which we
Right.
didn't used to really realize that you needed bright light exposure to make the hormone of darkness, or the vampire hormone, as melatonin has been referred to. So it can be confusing of, wait, why would you need bright light by day to make that darkness hormone? Turns out that there's many mechanisms there. And so beyond just that brain-based melatonin, we have this mitochondrial-based melatonin that we're looking to support by simply getting outside. So brighter days, darker nights are going to organize that sleep hygiene recommendation.
Right. And I love that you're taking this out of the bedroom, out of the context of night,
Yes.
and preparing the environment, which, by the way, and I know you're not remiss, but hadn't yet mentioned it, temperature is so key. You want to keep a cool environment. We
Of
spoke
course.
off we spoke off Mike, and by the way, you echo a lot of the sentiments spoken to Andrew before, Andrew Huberman. What he's doing,
Yeah.
and his own research is pretty remarkable, and I haven't heard anyone say it more than him. Get out first thing in the morning, get that sun exposure to reset the clock. I mean, during the day, it's a serotonergic dominant state that we desire, and at the night, it's the switch over to melatonin. Is one of the ways we do it, by getting that early sun exposure. But we spoke off Mike before the podcast recording here, and we have somebody that we really enjoy in common. His name is Rob Wolf.
Yeah.
We refer to him, hey Rob, as one of the OGs. But in context of Paleolithic, do what and eat what our ancestors ate, do what they do. One thing they did was not sleep in. They got that early morning sun, not only because it was what was naturally occurring, it was a hormonal signal for them to get up, go, and move. But the sun wakes us up, and we're as you pointed out, buildings, walls, rooms preclude us from that exposure. So we're naturally uninhibited. Most people think of this sort of, this incandescent light to be to blame. And that's true. But it's also because we are blocked literally from the trigger, which ultimately starts the natural circadian rhythm. At the DNA company, I'm really proud to suggest that we actually do research and look at the clock gene. We consider the role of the 5-HTTLPR polymorphism. That's the serotonergic transporter gene, which I think plays a huge role. We do a really good job at looking at executive function, mood, and behavior, even certain genes that control GABA and the folate. We could go. This is a whole other podcast, I'm sure, but
Oh, totally.
the methylation pathway is so key. So individuals with poor variations within the methylation pathway, without correcting that, is ultimately a problem, and we can solve for those things when you understand your genetic aptitude. I'm sure this is part and parcel to your at least on your radar. you can further focus in or hone in on the individual's, let's call them suboptimal variations, and know where to take more of a focus. Um, so before we get into the very crux of your program, because I want to talk about that in a little more detail and what you're finding and how people can get enrolled, are you ready for the myth or fact rapid fire on sleep?
Let's
You ready to
go.
go? All right, boom. I've got like 20 lined up. Let's see if we have the time to get through most or maybe all of them. All right, myth or fact. Number one, the body can adapt to functioning well on very little sleep.
Ah, myth.
Okay. Sleep deprivation, I couldn't agree with sleep deprivation can impair cognitive and motor skills as severely as alcohol intoxication after about 17 to 19 hours without sleep.
Fact.
Isn't that crazy? I mean, people
Yeah.
don't realize, you alluded to this, a couple of minutes ago, walking around like you're drunk. I mean, at the end of the
Yeah.
day, one single night of sleep. Did that happen to you when you went through those bouts of
Yes.
insomnia,
Absolutely.
disassociation, not, yeah, out of body
Yeah.
experience? I know in your story, you also talked about panic attacks. You were, I
Yes.
think, in the middle of the Colosseum in
Oh,
Rome, and you fell out, you fell, not to the floor necessarily, but you
yeah.
came down with a panic attack. So
Totally.
once
Yeah.
again, having that ability at night to recharge the nervous system, we're bioelectric beings. It's not just a bag of chemistry that's going on. There's that whole electrochemistry, and that's specific to the central nervous system. Without that ability to reboot, it's kind of like putting the big red reset button in a computer. You can't have a normal day ahead. You can't detoxify. You can't. So, myth or fact, lack of sleep can lead to weight gain by affecting hunger hormones.
Fact.
Boom.
Yeah, you're just speaking to and underscoring exactly what we're talking about, that spidering effect, these unexpected areas that become harder when we're not sleeping well. And then on the flip
Right.
side, when we start optimizing these things, the opposite can be true, that you can
Right.
support losing weight by improving your sleep. So it's really, really fascinating research.
For sure. How about this one? Snoring is just as harmless and doesn't indicate any serious health issues.
False. Snoring is
Absolutely.
a big red flag for us. We want to. One thing I do want to put in is the awareness that there's over 100 sleep wake disorders, and I am clear that many, many of us, and we have lots of different estimations of the numbers, but many of us are running around undiagnosed,
Right.
and this is massively impacting our health.
So let's just stuck. This was the intention of this myth or fact. So we can rapid fire, but we can also stop at some of these junctures. And you're getting, obviously, as I expected, 100% here. But when we're snoring, that is a low, or let's call it subclinical apnea, right? Apnea is a
Yeah.
very serious condition when you stop breathing momentarily or for many seconds on end. That's diagnosable through a sleep study. But if you're snoring, essentially low grade apnea is what the literature supports, correct?
Exactly. So, what I would really make sure I get the message out on this topic, so many people that we work with wouldn't even consider themselves as a possible candidate for dealing with something like, for instance, sleep apnea. We test, certainly every one on one we work with, we test immediately for sleep disorders. And I will say I'm biased. I do want to see a future where we are tested not just once, but multiple times throughout the course
Sure.
of our lives for sleep disorders. The same way, I think it will be looked back on as a true travesty, the same way we would never just test for blood pressure one
Right.
time and make all kinds of choices around health and well being. We would absolutely never do that. And we know this to be true. We do that with sleep disorders. Many people come our way and they were tested 10 years ago, and their treatment protocols are still based
Is the
off those
same,
old
remains the
numbers.
same. It's
Yeah,
ridiculous.
the dynamic nature of something like, for instance, sleep apnea is vast. And I also want this message to get out as well. Women are a kind of underserved group, in that one of the things that we do see is that while in kind of often below, say, around 40 years of age, we might be less likely to be dealing with sleep apnea than men. That tends to be the breakdown. But once we start navigating through perimenopause into menopause and postmenopause, we become on average closer to men, more 1 to 1 in our instances of developing sleep apnea. So if you were tested as a female in your 20s or something and had no forms of signs of sleep apnea, and now in your 40s or beyond, you could have developed this. This is dynamic, and same rules apply for men. The other
Right.
piece with men, as far as you can change just gain a little bit of weight can be a feature, but I don't want to reduce this because you can be slender and fit
Yes.
and have sleep apnea. So we
Yep.
really want to get that message out. And then also for a lot of the prevalence of hormone replacement therapies that we see for a lot of individuals, we do know that there tends to be some correlations between, for instance, testosterone and
Hmm.
utilizing TRT, and then instances of sleep apnea on the rise or the severity index going up. So there's a lot of nuance here, and do know that you can test on average at home for on commonly under around $200 in the United States, and just easy breezy in one night. And then there are more nuanced tests that you can take now, like with the sleep image ring, can use HRV and get us a little bit of a sense of the quality of your sleep. And then there's even at home tests like Onira is one that is the closest kind of to our closest approximation to in lab, but at home. And that can actually give us more information around other disorders that we wouldn't usually have thought we could test for at home, like restless leg, periodic limb movement disorder, other components that we didn't quite have access to before.
Wonderful insights. And as a clinician, I would fully lobby for that in home version. I mean, it's your, prodded, poked, not in your natural environment, a million EEG
Yeah.
tabs stuck to your head. And it's just not a fun thing when you're out of your own home. It's a little easier to do and you're in your own bed. Part of the sleep hygiene, by the way, one of the sort of check these boxes is like,
Yes.
how about remember to have a comfortable mattress that you're switching out every 10 or so, maybe even less years, because not being comfortable physically and or not recognizing what comfort is for your body, ortho comfort, is a problem as well. I love you pointing out hormones. Here's some
Mm.
insight for you, by the way, if you probably knew this. What we're finding at the DNA company, so apropos ages and stages,
Yeah.
particularly for women, and as they enter their peri and then menopausal stages, one of the things that, of course, is happening is, an age-old truth, revamped, of course, by the Women's Health Initiative. But we know that there's this estrogen deficiency. In many people, it's safe to take hormone replacement therapy, and others, it's not. But when you do, and you're of the genomic subtype of fast to convert progesterone into testosterone, and then again, fast to convert male or female testosterone into estrogen, that's not always, but typically the individual who downstream their metabolites are also one who's predisposed to weight gain, particularly abdominal weight gain. And so that correlation, age stage appropriate for that abdominal weight gain, as you said, it's not a weight issue for everybody, but in a male who's estrogen dominant and a female who's come from estrogen dominance, even if you give that male testosterone, where's it all going? It's overflowing into additional testosterone. A lot of guys don't realize this, and that contributes to, lackadaisic soft palate, abdominal obesity. The list is quite long, predisposing them to apnea, subclinical or otherwise. Myth or fact? During severe sleep deprivation, the brain can experience micro sleeps, which can be extremely dangerous, maybe life threatening.
Fact. Yes, micro sleeps are very concerning from a safety perspective, to say the least, among other problems that can come about with that. And it also brings to mind a another interesting component of kind of our false reality around when sleep gets problematic, to say the least. And something called paradoxical insomnia is something that we'll see commonly. It's something I dealt with, where our perception of the sleep that we're logging is flawed.
Right.
And we see that commonly. So I would have experiences where throughout the entire night, I would say, gun to my head, I didn't get any sleep. But what was likely was I was logging some pieces of sleep. Now, we're not trying to put a cap on what's possible. Certainly we want you to have the experience of having gone to bed, slept, and be rejuvenated the next day. But paradoxical insomnia is really interesting because we'll see people come in lab and swear up and down that they didn't sleep a wink, but
Right.
they actually did log sleep throughout the course of the night. And this is why sleep is so underserved, and I believe is going to be act as a vital sign in the future and treated as such, because our perception is often very gray. And I think that's one of the cool things about consumer grade tracking is that it starts to illuminate a bit more. Now, is it perfect? No. But we also, spoiler alert, we're seeing rumblings of even more clinical grade wearables that are about to be launching. So we'll have in the very near future access to more clinical grade wearable tech so that you are going to be seeing a lot more details about this thing you do a third of your life on average
Right.
26 years, right? So we want to know, how is that working? And to your point around micro sleeps and some of the dangers that can be brought about with that, that is just showing us that the body is trying to squeeze out some of what it's not properly receiving.
Right. Right. And hopefully, to your point, that maybe it's AI, maybe it's better tech wearable, we get beyond that sort of 80% or so, accuracy for insights. Alcohol, that helps you sleep
Oh,
better, right?
I love that one. False.
Yeah.
Now, what I'll say for to appease the listener that might have this kind of flawed logic of and there's a truth to what we often see in studies that when you have an alcoholic beverage, that often you have reduced sleep latency. So commonly you fall asleep with more ease, which is what many people experience, the old nightcap and what have you. And yet, that's where many of the positive, if you will, benefits start to just fall away. That's kind of the extent, because very quickly, then we start to see this whole severing and fragmentation of your sleep, changes in temperature, as you alluded to. When we think of the totem pole of some of the zeitgebers or time givers to your circadian health, we think of light dark, number one. Then we go to temperature timing so that you should have warmer body temperature rising throughout the course of the day. And then that marked drop into the evening to both signal sleep and then lull you into deeper levels of sleep. Now, of course, alcohol or THC are going to be disruptive to that crucial pattern. And so the other thing that we see with something like alcohol and THC tends to be splintered or reduced REM. And if we're looking to have that inner therapist show up routinely, and commonly when people say, "Oh, I need a drink, it's been a rough day or month or whatever," you would think that this would be serving our ability to work through the stressors in our life. But ironically, this is actually then suppressing your amount of REM that you're able to log. And then your ability to handle the things in your life is then impacted. So it is
Right.
such a huge component for us to consider. And the last thing I'll say about alcohol is that this goes under the umbrella of chronopharmacology, the timing of our drugs, and how the timing of those drugs can massively affect our circadian health and certainly our sleep results. So, with alcohol, what we see for people that are tracking, so if you're tracking and listening to this, you've probably seen this where if you've ever had a drink and you have wearables, you've probably seen just how massively that hits at your sleep results, particularly the nervous system indicators. So, heart rate, HRV, respiratory rate, body temperature. And then if you do have sleep disorders, which many people just have no clue they do, but I'm clear many people listening right now have sleep disorders and they just don't know it,
Yeah.
are often being flared up if they're of the, kind of respiratory variety or others. So alcohol is a big
Huge issue.
kryptonite to your sleep.
It's a huge issue. Not to mention, it's just frying your brain cells. And,
Yeah.
people have varying degrees of ability to cope. I don't just mean acetaldehyde, dehydrogenase, alcohol dehydrogenase. I'm talking about like just the ability to handle, and from a socio psycho perspective, alcohol. So, what it's doing to your sleep, what it's doing to your health, it's just worthy of considering kicking. Altogether, no good can really come from it. And speaking of REM and that light phase of sleep where the proverbial psychologist may come out, true or false? The brain is it essentially paralyzes the body. You become paralyzed, during that time.
Yes, and we want to become paralyzed during REM. This is so crucial. I had a guest on the podcast, this Dr. Stasha Gomanek, and
Mhm.
she's really trying to get out the message that vitamin D and B vitamins being so crucial to your sleep results. And as a neurologist, and one of the reasons why I liked her analogy of how she thought about or explains for people the need to paralyze properly during sleep. She analogizes it to a plumber, and plumber comes into your home. You've got some sort of issue with your pipes. In order to do the fixing that needs to be done, you have to turn off the water valves, if you will. So that what's
Mhm.
happening, you need to turn those off to be able to go to work. And so part of her analogy was that we need to properly paralyze to do the work that we need to do to prepare the body into the next day and feel properly rejuvenated. What we're seeing commonly is that so many of us are not properly paralyzing throughout some of these periods. And we see a lot of people dealing with REM dominant sleep apnea. And REM dominant sleep apnea makes a lot of sense because if you think about REM, it's almost like you're watching TV suddenly. And so your brain state looks so active. It looks akin to being awake. Like you might think that that person is awake if you're not seeing them laying in bed. Um, so now they're breathing differently commonly during REM, and that can bring about more respiratory based disorders. And so if we're moving, and so things like restless leg syndrome, periodic limb movement disorders, other things that can disrupt the body's ability to stay in those stages that we're looking to cultivate. Every time you come out of those stages, remember you got to then kind of go back through that, stair step to each one of those stages to get back into that state. So that is huge, the fragmentation piece. And the last thing I'll say there is that there is something that is being purported to be available in the near future, which is sleep age. And you know how many of us
Hmm.
can test for our, chronological versus biological age, and that's like a new fun thing to do. Now, in the future, using AI, what we anticipate is that we'll be able to test for your sleep age. And if you are 40 but sleeping like a 60-year-old, what would some of the characteristics of that be? Sleep fragmentation is especially a big
Right.
marker. And so that's where we want to get at the source of, and that paralyzation aspect is a big piece of that.
Right. Okay. We've talked about so much. We're going to do the last couple of minutes here. We're almost out of time with some serious value add that if people wanted the long version, they can always hit you up on your website and or involve themselves in your program, which we're about to learn about. But we're going to go myth, fact throughout the next 10 or so as fast as we possibly can.
Okay.
Ready? You can catch up on lost sleep over the weekend.
Ugh, this one is controversial. So what I'll say is
Oh, okay. I'm
I know. So
surprised.
no, I know.
Okay.
So the ultimate answer, so my what I'll say is it is a no, but I will also say there is you can do a little bit on the immediacy
Okay.
after say you had like a rough night. We believe out of some research that you can get a little bit and it can make sense to kind of augment your sleep window a tiny bit. You go to bed a little bit earlier. You can sleep in a little bit later, but we're talking like 30 minutes type of thing. And so you're by no means, and I don't want to confuse anything, can we just augment our sleep time and think that that is going to compensate? That's a very poor coping mechanism that many of us are
Right.
utilizing. So to get more nuance, there's like little shavings that you can kind of support yourself to try to support. We see this with like shift work, etc. But for overall, you cannot manage your sleep like that.
Okay. The older you get, the less sleep you need.
Okay, so well, I'll say this is again a nuanced one. We see older people sleeping less. We do see that. However, there are questions in our modern society of is that does it have to go quite that way? And does it have to be so egregious? So if the average healthy adult is estimated to be sleeping 7 to 9 hours, but then often we'll say things like, well, we'll see people 65 and over starting to go a little below that, more in the 6 to 7 range, for instance. And we do see that commonly. And there are theories about the why on that. But there are questions of, does it have to quite always be a hard and fast rule?
Right. Mollie Eastman, you cannot answer a question in short form. It's clearly because of your level of expertise on the matter. Just a couple
I
more.
know.
You should always, here's a couple more. You should always wake up naturally without an alarm.
Mm. I actually disagree with this one, at least in the
Mhm.
beginning stages of optimizing your sleep or starting to bring in that those sleep hygiene principles. Many times we require in our modern society a system to keep that consistent wake time. Now, eventually, we might be able to remove that, but there can be a time and a place to use that in the meantime.
Napping during the day is bad.
Napping during the day can be great. Now, there is a group that you might want to avoid that for a period of time. That group is if you're dealing with chronic insomnia and you're having difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep, that can be a time where you might want to abstain from napping for that period to build up proper adenosine and sleep pressure. But for the average person that's not dealing with that, short and early naps can be wonderful.
Okay, and very last one. Sleep plays a critical role in learning and memory consolidation.
Oh, yes. What a great bow on it all. It's
Right.
so crucial. I speak to high performers all the time. If you want to be able to be firing at all cylinders, the MMA poker players that I work with are thought of as cognitive athletes, having to
Right.
be making important decisions for hours at a time at the table. They have to have that sleep dialed in.
Do you know Nelson Dellis, by the way? Do you know
I
Nelson? Do you know
don't.
any of the memory athletes out there? These people that are just incredible, what they can remember and
Like
store over time.
moonwalking with Einstein and that sort of thing. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
right.
cognitive athlete piece is fascinating.
Unbelievable what they can do, and they all attest to the fact that exercise and sleep is priority, and almost always diet supplementation is sort of down the line. Important but sort of secondary. Okay,
Yeah.
quickly bring us through what it means to become enrolled in part of the program, and how do we become a part of the program?
Yeah, absolutely. And first off, if anyone's listening and they're just kind of mildly interested in sleep, we do have a lot of free things that people can do. So we have a weekly podcast, the Sleep is a Skill podcast, and we've had people from your own company over chatting with us about lots of different angles in and how to optimize your sleep. So that's the sleep podcast. We have the newsletter and all kinds of other things. But if you are looking to take your sleep to the next level and get some support in doing that, every person we work with is required to wear the Aura Ring right now. That could shift in the future, but the Aura Ring at this moment. So, one, you can have a wearable audit. So, audit at least your Aura Ring or Whoop Band, and then we'll give you things to do right away based on what we're seeing. Then, a more
And
intense look is
this is the sorry to interrupt. This is the
yeah.
optimize your sleep course, right? This is the
So the
signature course.
wearable audit would be our lowest hanging fruit if someone
Okay.
just wants to kind of dip their toe in and say, oh, take a look at my data. We stream it through on our dashboard and then can give you personalized things that you can do. But then our Optimize Your Sleep program is an 8 week long program where we will thread in your sleep tracking information. Then we have you go through an 8 week long module and you're coming in on weekly calls that are live and small groups. So you get individualized support as well as a community. So you can be asking your questions, sharing your screenshots of, what does this mean with my daytime stress numbers or all the things. And throughout that, what you're doing is going through our circadian rhythm entrainment protocols. So what that looks like is light, dark, temperature timing, meal timing, thought timing, which is a fascinating one. Our thoughts exist on a circadian rhythm, which many people don't
Right.
realize. Yeah, that one's really cool. Exercise timing, chronopharmacology, the timing of our drugs, and time shifting. So if you are traveling or daylight saving time or what have you. So you're going through those things so that on the other side, you are leaving with a whole different set of stats and tools to influence this sleep skill set. Finally, We do have one-on-ones where in our one-on-ones, you right out of the gate, we're testing you for sleep disorders. And we're also testing you with different lab tests so that we're getting a whole sense of your blood work, urine analysis. Often do bring in the genetic testing and other elements that can give us the whole picture of what's going on with your sleep. And then have you going through these protocols more one-on-one.
Amazing. Well, I think I'm one of your next clients because although I feel, to
Come on
your
in.
earlier point, full circle, no, I mean, I just feel like I do sleep incredibly well. There's always ways in which you can optimize. I feel like there are sleep going from, problem to solution. A lot of people need that out there, but then there's sleep that can go from good to better. I feel like I'm probably a
Yes.
part of that. And why not want, by the way, before I let you go, and I'm already over time with you, and I apologize, but I'm going
No,
to
it's
plant a literal seed here. I got to put this on your radar. It just occurred to me. One of my areas of expertise is traveling the planet, boots on the ground, into the manufacturers of the raw materials that supply the
mm,
consumer facing supplement brands. And there is a new ingredient. So this is like out with the melatonin and out with the 5-hydroxytryptophan. But there's a new ingredient. I've always been extremely excited about California poppy. This is a mu1 and mu2 receptor agonist with 5-HTT upregulation, so serotonin regulation. But there's a new player on the block. And I said, plant a seed because it's literally lettuce seed extract. Have you heard of this?
that is very interesting. A client had sent me it was an article about this. Now, I can't say that I have lots of testing on this because many times
Yeah.
we get to see how it responds for
Yeah.
many individuals. So we don't have a lot of data, but it is intriguing. What are your
La-
thoughts there?
Lactuca sativa. Well, I'm just starting to try with my patients and getting great feedback. And it's sort of a revolving or rolling N of one over time. So I like what the literature has to say. I like that it's non-addictive. I think we've got an opiate epidemic, and I think we've got a lot of sleep
Yes.
drugs. To your previous experience, benzos, those are quickly addictive. So we got to find alternatives. I think
Yes.
natural, sort of paves the way for that. So thank you, Mollie, for your wealth of information and for lending your time at the DNA Talks podcasts. Where social media and your social handle, your website, just throw those out for everybody so they know where to go.
Absolutely. Well, number one, thank you so much for saying everything you said there, and would love to support you and others as much as I can. I just want to underscore my mission on the planet is to help support as many people as possible in getting in the driver's seat with their sleep, or hopefully bringing like this new fascination with this thing we do routinely every single night. So I love your shared interest in this. I so appreciate it because it gets the momentum and energy going, because I believe that this can change the planet the more we prioritize this. So love, love, love. And as far as different steps that people can take, sleepisaskill.com acts as a great bucket for all kinds of actions that you can take there, as well as social media is all linked there. And if you want to search for it, depending on which platform, it's at Mollie, Mollie.Eastman. You can also search Sleep is a Skill if that's easier on all platforms to pull up more information for free. Because would love to just at least get this conversation going, because that can help us with this skill set building. This interest is key.
Absolutely. Okay, that's amazing. Thank you so much. And we'd like to thank you all for tuning in and listening to today's episode of the DNA Talks podcast. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below, especially if there's a certain topic that you'd like us to discuss more in the future. You can also listen to this podcast on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. And if you wish to learn more, add us to your list of liked podcasts so you can be up to date when the next one hits. Speaking of up to date, you can also find us on Instagram at DNA Talks Podcast, as well as my own handle at Wild on Health. Once again, thank you. And Mollie and I wish you sweet dreams.
We certainly do. Thank you so much.